This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 368, Image Optimization. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about image optimization with Martin Anderson-Clutz. Martin joined Aqua in 2021 and has been using Drupal since version 4.6. He helps maintain a growing list of contributed modules and has spoken at various camps, conferences, specifically about performance. Martin lives in London, Ontario, Canada, with his wife, son, cat, and dog. Martin, welcome back to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Great to be here.
I'm Nick Laughlin, the founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are Taryn Almendarez, developer advocate at Pantheon and lead of the Drupal Diversity and Inclusion Initiative. Welcome to the show.
Hey, good to be back.
And also joining us this week is John, a solutions architect at EPAM.
Hey, everyone.
Okay, this week we do have a couple of news items for you.
Yeah, coming in hot from the world of Drupal. The at-large board elections are happening right now. So if you have not voted yet, you can go. There'll be a link in the show notes. You can learn about each person that is running. You can vote. Note that you have to have a Drupal.org user account in order to vote.
That's actually not quite the case. You have to be a Drupal Association member to be able to vote.
Thank you for clarifying that. Yes, you are correct. But the reason we are bringing it up is because voting closes October 19th. So make sure you get out there and rock the vote. Also, from the world of Drupal, DrupalCon Pittsburgh. I know we just got done with Prague and now we're talking about Pittsburgh, but call for papers is open and that actually closes October 17th. So October, big month for Drupal. So if you want to speak at DrupalCon Pittsburgh, you should get your ideas in. Now, keep in mind, because I was reminded of this yesterday by somebody, you don't have to have your whole talk done and ready to go. You just need a really good description and an idea of what you want to talk about. So if you're like me and you have a fairly good idea, write a paragraph that describes it and submit it before the 17th.
Up to 2 ideas per person.
Yes.
Thank you.
Oh, interesting. We also have a short message from Steven this week talking about NetCamp.
Hey, the New England Drupal Camp is happening on November 18th and 19th in Providence, Rhode Island. NetCamp is a 2-day event. Friday is our training day with half and full day trainings. Saturday is our session day with 20 sessions and a keynote. Our keynote speaker is Colleen Clarkston. He is a remote work expert, and we'll be talking about career contributions and how community can change your life. And it did it for him. Our training and sessions cover a variety of topics, including accessibility, Drupal 101, front end, decoupled, career development, and much, much more. We also have some extras here. So if you come to NetCamp, we have a social event on Friday evening hosted at Oomph, our event sponsor. We also provide breakfast, lunch, and an after party on Saturday. And yes, we have some t-shirts. So come get your t-shirt. We also have a Contrib Day on Friday. So don't miss that as well. You can visit netcamp.org to register and learn more. Register for training, register for sessions. Hopefully we see you there.
Thank you, Stephen, for that. Definitely looking forward to NetCamp. And speaking of talks, I have a talk coming up in NetCamp about that might be relevant for today's talk. It talks about making a static site and optimizing it, maybe not images, but just the site itself. So I have to actually polish that off and finish it up for NetCamp in about 6 weeks. So we also have a module of the week this week. The module is Toolbar Manager. Martin, do you want to tell us a little bit about what that module is?
Yeah, absolutely. So Toolbar Manager is a great little module that allows a site builder to really customize exactly what items are going to be in the toolbar at the top of the web page. So they can do things like change up the text labels, reorder the items that are going to appear in that toolbar. They can also assign custom CSS class names. So if they want to change icons or some of those kinds of things, it's really just a nice little utility module that can make that experience of being a Drupal site admin a little bit nicer.
Do you know if it works with the admin toolbar module as well, or is it just the core toolbar?
It does work with the admin toolbar, and I've also used it with the Gin admin theme as well. So,
oh, awesome.
So just to be clear, it doesn't allow you to like add items into the menu. You'd still have to do that through the menu system. It just allows you to kind of manage the existing ones a little bit through the UI, basically.
Right, exactly. And I know that there are some distros that require certain modules that inject things into that toolbar. So if there are modules like that put in items that you actually don't really want, then this is a nice, simple way to be able to manage those.
Interesting.
Pretty helpful.
Okay, moving on to our primary topic this week, image optimization. Let's start with, the burning question on everybody's mind. When we say image optimization, what are we talking about?
So I would say, generally speaking, at least when we talk about the sort of topic of today's episode, it's really around sort of reducing the impact of images to the extent that they contribute to the time it takes for web pages to load on your website. If we wanted to get sort of in the weeds technically, there's also sort of a technique of image optimization, which is using specialized utilities that can go through and do things like enhance the compression, maybe strip out metadata and some of those other things. But I think we'll probably get to that in time here.
So this might be a silly question, but that's usually what I'm good for. Can you talk about why image optimization is important? Why should people optimize their images?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say the performance of your website, how quickly the pages load, is just generally speaking very important for a couple of reasons. So number one, for SEO, Google has communicated that page speed is a ranking factor. And so the faster your website is, the more traffic it's going to get. But just more generally, it's also sort of a crucial component in the user experience of people coming to your website. And there's been lots of studies and data to demonstrate that whatever success looks like for your website, it's going to have more of it if the site loads more quickly. Yeah. So if it's an e-commerce site, the number of cart abandonments you're going to get is lower with a faster site. If you're looking for leads, web form submissions, you're going to get more of those if the site loads quickly. So just a few examples of the ways that you're going to have more success with your site if the pages load quickly. And if you look at the Web Archive, the Web Almanac, and there is actually a link in the show notes directly to the chart that I'm referencing. It's a pretty linear line in terms of web pages on average sort of requiring more and more data to load over time. And just in the last 10 years, they estimate that that's gone up by 600%. So it's definitely a growing problem. And also, if you look at the data, again, on the same page, there's a chart that really demonstrates that images are by far the biggest part of that problem in terms of sort of, the weight of pages over time.
Do you feel like it's been highlighted or it's been accelerated due to the popularity of like mobile devices, right? So like one of the big things that you're thinking about, like when your page is loading, right, is that, hey, somebody could be loading this on their mobile device on a 4G network or a 3G network. Like they need to be able to do that quickly, even at lower speeds, right? So is that something that has pushed the importance of image optimization over the last, say, 5 years, 10 years?
I think that's definitely a fair statement. So the shift to mobile devices in terms of how people are consuming, how people are sort of surfing the internet has been a driver towards this recognition of the importance of performance. So as an example, I know when Google introduced the page speed as a ranking factor was originally a negative ranking factor, but specifically for mobile search results. And I think that sort of demonstrates how that shift towards mobile devices has really pushed this discussion forward.
Martin. Oh, sorry, John.
No, you're right. I imagine that also factors into like developing countries and accessing things, on networks that are a little bit slower too, but all related.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Martin, I was actually going to ask you a bit more about accessibility and inclusion being so important to image optimization. When I worked in local governments, one of the things that we realized was that the bulk of our members were people that were from lower income classes. In America, with all these disproportionate ways that people are impacted, lots of them were primarily accessing the website from their mobile devices. So can you talk a little bit about how having good image optimization helps you to have a more accessible and inclusive site?
I think that specific use case is probably a really good demonstration of the importance of using techniques like responsive images, where you can really tailor potentially the, how it's cropped and some of those other things, but more fundamentally how that image is sized so that people who are on, a smaller handset, potentially something that is, very low resolution, can be fed a much smaller file. And from that standpoint is probably going to, consume less bandwidth, because I have to imagine that in that kind of a use case, you may even be talking about people that are on more of like a pay-as-you-go type plan, where they have a significantly lower cap on bandwidth before that starts to incur additional charges and so on as well.
Yeah, we often think about inclusion as being people that are lower income, but there are so many people. I live in Texas that are out in rural areas and they are dependent on satellite internet. So very helpful. I was going to ask, so segueing into Drupal, because the site I worked on was the Drupal website. What are some image optimization techniques that you can use with Drupal?
So I would say at a high level, the three primary approaches that you want to think about are deferring the load of images, so lazy loading. The second one would be really sizing the images to really be only what's being shown to the user. And then sort of the third bucket is really around optimizing the images themselves. So from a lazy loading standpoint, the good news is that since Drupal 9.1, Drupal has actually implemented a property. It was originally pioneered by Google, but it's started to get some uptake from some other browsers as well. So that really out of the box, modern installs of Drupal will lazy load images by default. But there are contrib modules that potentially can give you more customization, will work with older versions of Drupal and so on. Within sort of that sizing bucket, I would say the sort of secondary concepts you want to think about are really cropping the image. So I've seen a lot of sites where they load a huge image and then only show a tiny part of it. And obviously in terms of, a performance standpoint, forcing the visitor's browser to download all of that image area that's not even being shown is pretty wasteful. So if you can actually crop the image itself, then that's going to be much better. In the same way, actually sizing the images or shrinking them down to sort of how they're being displayed, as opposed to just reducing them in size via CSS, is again going to make for a faster experience of downloading those images. And the challenge there sometimes is that, again, we talked a little bit around those different devices. Obviously, you want to have, the appropriate sized image for, mobile users versus, someone on a giant desktop. So being able to use responsive images is definitely key for those kinds of use cases. And the good news is that, Drupal itself has built-in capabilities for sort of, the resizing with image styles and responsive images. And then that third bucket for optimizing the images, what I would usually put in there is making sure you're using an appropriate format and then doing whatever processing possible to sort of, sort of tightly optimize the stripping out any extra metadata and so on.
Martin, do you recommend, I've heard a technique used in the past, sometimes is on mobile devices, smaller screens, possibly lower bandwidth devices, potentially removing images. And when I say removing them, I mean like unnecessary images. Is that something that you've done or you recommend?
I feel like I've probably seen that in sites I've worked on, maybe for sort of big background images and some of those kinds of use cases. Particularly where, as you say, for, on a mobile device, it may not necessarily be adding that much value, and because they are more likely to be on a slower connection. But I would say in general, probably more steered towards just using kind of responsive images and some of those other kinds of techniques.
Makes sense.
So you had mentioned format, using a good format is one of the things that you can do to optimize the images on your site. What are the best formats to use on the web?
So when you run a tool like, let's say, Google Lighthouse, oftentimes one of the recommendations it will suggest to you is to use what it calls next generation format. And the next generation formats, I would say, that are probably the most popular today would be Webp, which is really sort of I would say, a raster image format. It evolved out of a video codec, actually, and then Google sort of pioneered that, put that forward as sort of an open spec for a modern format that would allow images to be compressed to smaller file sizes to sort of give the same visual fidelity. SVG is, by contrast, more of a vector format. So instead of defining images kind of pixel by pixel, you're actually defining sort of points and lines. And the benefit there is that it's actually scalable. So, the same SVG image can be used for a 5x5 icon on a page, but also used as sort of a full screen background and look good at either resolution. And then the third one that I would mention is AVIF, which is a more modern format. It's actually the sort of still image version of the AV1 video codec that's growing in popularity. But I would say in terms of adoption rate, last time I checked, it was around 70% in terms of, if you go on to like caniuse.com, something like that. So most times I would probably say it's good to probably focus on Webp and SVG.
I was hoping that Avif was a replacement for GIF, just because it would prevent the argument whether it's pronounced GIF or GIF.
Well, I mean, to be fair, that's kind of like SVG,
it's not,
right? SVG is, we're not going to have this conversation. Back to your corners. I feel like SVGs are the replacement for GIF image is like nowadays. Would that be a fair statement, Martin?
I'm interested in your opinion, Martin.
So I believe that both Webp and AVIF support animations. And so I would say those are probably more direct replacements just because they are pixel formats, whereas you can do animations with SVG, but it's almost more of like something like working with Flash if you want to go back in your time machine, in the sense of it being that animation format.
Yeah, so I guess I was only thinking of like the icon replacement aspects, right? Like everybody loves SVGs for icon replacement, A, because you can colorize them via CSS, and B, because you can scale them pretty easily. And if you've ever tried to scale a GIF, it can be a nightmare. So that's interesting. I did not think of the key GIF reason, right, is the animated GIF.
Yeah. So before we move on to the next question, I'd like to dig into that a little bit more, because many times, when somebody uploads a GIF, that is the largest element on the page. Do you get kind of similar benefits if you convert that to WebP? Like, is it like like how much of a reduction in size are you getting? I guess let me ask this question again. Can you tell us, maybe first for GIF, because that's what we're talking about, but how much of a size reduction are you getting by using these new formats over, a JPEG or a PNG?
So the honest answer would have to be it's really going to depend on the image, but the stats that I've seen are roughly about like 25% smaller for WebPs, 25% smaller than PNGs or JPEGs. So the nice thing about
Okay.
WebP is it also works for, both photographic images like continuous tone, as well as more kind of, line art and graphics that way. Whereas using the older formats, there was definitely some images that were better suited to like PNGs and some that were better suited to JPEGs. One of the things that's nice about WebP is that it's meant to sort of handle both pretty well. AVIF, I've heard, is even smaller than WebP, but I've also heard some anecdotal evidence that it may actually be better for continuous tone than it is for more line art type images.
Okay. What about GIFs? That's my main.
He wants to go back to GIFs.
Yeah,
Let's go back. Let's go back to GIFs or GIFs. You say it your way. I'll say it my way.
We can call it just graphical. What is it? Graphical interlaced. Something. Graphics interchange format. Yeah. So Martin, are you aware of the same savings for GIFs in WebP? Is it like 25% or is it larger? Because that's kind of the one format that's been really hard to compress.
So I will confess that I don't have sort of a specific number for that comparison in mind. I would imagine that it's even better because it's, when you talk about sort of the, the video compression algorithm built into the GIF format, that it's even older than thinking about something like JPEG or PNG. So I would think that it's even better. The only example I've heard people say of where a GIF can actually be smaller is if you're using transparency, because it uses more of a 1-bit mask as opposed to like an 8-bit mask the way you'll have in like a PNG or some of the more modern formats. So just doing a standard export, you'll get cleaner edges, but there is sort of a storage impact or image size impact to that.
Okay. Nick, are you satisfied now? Can we move? Okay,
Ready to go.
That's a great question.
Wow, who knew GIFs were such a hot button topic? Okay, so let's talk about WebP for a second, because I've heard a lot about WebP. We just spent a bunch of time talking about WebP. Again, it was kind of announced by Google in 2010. It offers better compression than JPEGs and PNGs. Also seems to kind of encompass, animation with GIFs. Sounds like the internet super image format, if I could, raise it to that plateau. I'm wondering, if it's so versatile, so easily compressed, does all of these things, when do you think, Drupal might start using it in a more widely accessible way, right? I mean, I think you can add a module to add support for it now, but is this something that could come to core at some point?
It's already in core, as a matter of fact. It has
been in core
since 9.2. It's, I think, probably not as widely adopted, maybe, or implemented as it could be. Mm-hmm. But there are also some advantages to using some of the contrib modules that are available. So as an example, if you use, let's say, the WebP module with Image Optimize API, you can have it sort of create a picture element where you've got both the WebP and then sort of a standard JPEG as a fallback, so that if somebody is using a browser that doesn't support WebP, then they can see the JPEG as well.
Oh, hold on a second. So what do you upload as an asset? Do you upload the JPEG or the WebP?
You would upload the JPEG, although technically you could probably upload like a TIFF or PNG, whatever file format that your graphics library can actually process.
I forgot about TIFFs. It just reminded me of a client that wanted to upload some TIFFs that were like 600 megabytes because they were design plans. And I was like, these are never going, this was 15 years ago too. I was like, these are never going to load. But that brings up another question actually, because I remember when WebP first came out, there was...
Well, hold the phone for a second. I just want to make sure I'm understanding this completely accurately. So you're saying I can upload a JPEG, Drupal will convert it into a WebP and then use the WebP wherever it makes sense?
Right. So it would basically create a picture tag that has two image tags within it. One with the WebP, so that browsers that can support that format will load that, and then
Sure.
a fallback format that's the JPEG for the whatever 3% of other visitors that might not.
Interesting. So
WebP supporting
Drupal can
browser.
produce a WebP, which is like awesome to me. Like I'm gonna start doing that all over the place now.
I mean, technically, you might say it's the GD library or ImageMagick that's actually generating the WebP, but
Sure.
Drupal is orchestrating the process for sure.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
That actually answered my question, because I remember the first time I implemented WebP, there was a lot of workaround because there just wasn't a lot of support. And it looks like there's significantly more support. You said there's about 3% of people that use browsers that can't support that. Is that, older devices, or is there a particular platform that you have to watch out for?
So if my memory serves me well, it's things like, Opera Mini and sort of less frequently used browsers that have been sort of dragging their feet. I think originally it was just Chrome that had the WebP support, because it was, as we've talked about, the Google, suggested format. But over time, Safari and some of those other popular browsers have added the support for it as well.
I'm gonna dig back into this for one more second. One more question. So is this an image style that you would add as like a processor to that image? Like how do you upload a JPEG and then have it use a WebP on the front end?
So usually I would implement that by using the Image Optimize API module, and then the WebP module. There's another one I think it's called Image Optimize WebP. Either one of those, you basically implement that as one of the steps in that pipeline.
Got it.
There is also a module called Image Optimize AVIF and WebP that will actually do both. So it'll create the AVIF and then a fallback WebP and then a fallback JPEG. But I think that one, if I recall correctly, might not have a stable release. So,
Interesting. I have a really, never mind. Let's keep moving on. My aside is not going to be useful. Yeah. Totally not related to anything we're talking about.
Okay. Well, Martin, I've got a question. So all of these different doodads that we're doing in our Drupal sites, modules can do all this magic, but there are some fundamental things that we can do. People that are content editors, people that are designing the art that's going to go on your site, to help that image optimization process go better. It's kind of two-pronged, so I'll ask the first one first. What should we be doing to our images before we upload them to make sure that this can be more successful?
So I would say that as a site builder, typically I want to require as little as possible from those content creators in terms of what they need to do with the image before uploading it. So, it should be able to do the work of putting it into, one of those modern formats, crop and resizing it, those kinds of things. That being said, the example Nick mentioned earlier of having this, like giant TIFF file that's 160 megabytes, and the server is going to spend like 3 hours trying to process this thing. Obviously, if you're talking about this ginormous image to start with, either scaling that down or even cropping it into the actual area that you want to use, some of those kinds of things are just going to lighten the load in terms of what you're asking the web server to do. So those I feel like are probably the kind of extreme cases of what you would do. But I would say yes, in general, you can get Drupal to do most of the heavy lifting for you.
So how do you go about? I guess this is a bit of a diversion, but I'm curious about how you guys go about documenting and working with the content editors on these types of things, though. So, like you said, Martin, a lot of it is you try to prevent your users from having to know as much as technical details they need to about this side of things. But there are some things to educate your content editors on. What are your thoughts on the best way to do that?
So I would say the number one way would be to have that well documented. So if you've got sort of, end user documentation for content editors, those kinds of things, making sure that's part of the process to say, make sure it's not some weird format that's just we know isn't supported. Like, I feel like there's a HEIC, I want to say. That's some kind of an Apple specific image format that it uses for sort of high dynamic range images that certain systems tend to choke on. So there may be examples like that of image formats that users may be using without necessarily realizing it. And then if they try and upload that to a server that doesn't support those formats, then that can potentially have issues. Definitely, if you're doing any kind of actually training with some of those users, making sure that that's part of the training, just saying, hey, heads up, it's in there, but also just be aware that there are these kinds of things. I mean, I will say anecdotally, one of the worst offenders for image optimization I've ever seen was a customer who had uploaded a high-res image that somehow they downloaded from a stock agency as a PNG file. And so it was like a 14 megabyte PNG file. And at the time, because it wasn't using Webp that could handle either one gracefully, it just made it a slightly better PNG file, but it was still like 13 megabytes or something. So yeah, user education can definitely go a long way.
So would you agree? Typically, I tell content editors to upload an image in the largest form that it's ever going to be used on the site, right? So like if you think of like a header image, right? Typically those are big, they're kind of like longer, right? And they always ask like, well, how should I upload this? And I always tell them like, upload it in the largest format it's going to appear on the page, optimize for that, and then Drupal will handle all the rest and sizing it down appropriately, cropping it appropriately, doing all that. Would you agree with that statement?
Absolutely. And I think the only other thing I would add is in terms of the image quality, in terms of how you save that original file, try to save it with as little compression as possible. Because again, Drupal is going to add compression as it creates those other sizes. And so you're less likely to get any kind of, secondary artifacts if it hasn't had a lot of compression applied at the original size.
Right. My favorite like old school problem was always the person that would upload a JPEG sized appropriately, but it would be like 300 DPI. And you're just like, and they're like, I don't understand. And I'm like, this picture is like 600 meg. Like,
I know one way that I found a lot of success for that content editing education experience was just proactively putting guardrails around the content editing experience. It's like, okay, this is where you can use this. This is how big it has to be, because otherwise you had people running back and forth and not understanding why their very small image that they uploaded for their profile picture was very blurry and pixelated.
Yeah, that's funny because like obviously the image upload fields have like image sizes on them, and that's where you'd always run into the DPI issue because somebody'd be like, I don't understand why I can't upload this picture, and I'm like, just change it to 72 DPI, and then there you go, you're all set. And they're like, oh, okay, perfect.
That's assuming that they know how to do that and what the difference is, though.
Hey, listen. Empower people to figure out how to edit their images or get their web agency to do it for them.
Yes.
So we've talked a lot about a bunch of different image formats, right? I'm wondering if there are certain use cases to which you think you should use certain image formats. So, I think we talked about kind of Webp being like a more universal image format. And then like obviously GIFs for like, or SVGs for icons and things like that. But do you have any like other rules that kind of apply to those sorts of things?
I think that's pretty close. I mean, Webp being something that works for both, continuous tone images as well as things that are more, kind of like line art makes it a good sort of general purpose format. SVGs obviously work really well for icons. There are also some super cool things you can do, with a combination of sort of like CSS and SVGs in terms of, doing different hover effects and different kinds of things that way. So depending on how kind of ambitious you want to be in terms of really crafting more of an interactive experience, SVGs can be, kind of a nice rabbit hole to dive down in terms of the different ways that it can really be customized.
So question on SVGs and WebPs, right? One of the benefits, and we already talked about this, of SVGs is the ability to like colorize them via CSS. Can you do that with a WebP?
I imagine that there's some, I'm definitely not a CSS wizard, so I'm sure, somebody will probably post in the Slack channel a bunch of different ways that you can do that. I'm sure there are things you can do with like overlays of color.
Sure.
But I don't think, off the top of my head, I'm not aware of any way that you can actually use CSS to sort of directly colorize the image.
Got it.
I think also too, something to point out is, like you said, the idea is to have the end user upload a JPEG or a PNG, right? So I think the same guidelines that generally existed for those will still exist. Meaning, one of the things I usually tell my clients is, if it has text on it, it should be a PNG. If it's like a photograph, it should be a JPEG. And that's one of the high level things. And I imagine that's true, because if somebody puts a text heavy JPEG in and then Drupal converts that to WebP, it's still going to look like garbage, I imagine, because the input's going to be garbage. Is that true, or does WebP do some magic and fix JPEGs that are full of text?
So if the JPEG has been saved with a bunch of compression and now it's got like a bunch of really nasty compression artifacts, it's not going to magically clean that up. But if somebody saves a JPEG, decent size, pretty good quality, and then you're scaling that down and using it as a WebP, then it's probably going to look fine. So, it's definitely garbage in, garbage out, but there's potential nuances there in terms of exactly how that image was generated.
All right, so speaking of image generation, it seems like you come onto a project sometimes and magically SVGs exist already. How do you generate SVGs? Where does the magic come from?
So SVGs, so technically you can get SVGs from, there's online libraries. So you could go to like IcoMoon or, different places that there are even websites that really specialize in SVGs. I've seen ones where you can either like drag sliders to change the weights of different things and then download it as something that's ready to upload. But if you were generating one yourself, typically you'd be using some kind of a drawing program. Like an Adobe Illustrator, I like Affinity Designer myself, but there's a variety of different ones.
Inkscape is the open source.
I think I have used Inkscape specifically for its tracing tool, which can be helpful for that. There's another one that I used to use that was free on Mac called Boxy SVG, which is good for very simple things, but definitely doesn't have sort of, at least in my experience, as robust drawing tools. And so if you're starting off with something that either is going to be created specifically for an SVG, then you can definitely use that kind of a vector drawing program. If it's something that you want to create an SVG from, so let's say, an organization's logo, then definitely you want to try and source that as, vector artwork to start with. So some PDFs are going to be a good starting point. Sometimes organizations will have, like a branding guidelines page where you can download that as like an EPS or, different kinds of vector formats. But that is, I would say, definitely probably the biggest challenge of using SVGs is being able to source that vector artwork as the starting point.
I do want to call out too that there's a couple of things that are a little bit different about SVGs too. So for example, you can take a really high quality JPEG and optimize it and get it smaller and ready for the web. You can also do SVGs are vector formats and can be blown up or get smaller, but depending on the size that you need them. But that doesn't mean that the file itself is fully optimized. And they can be a little bit harder. There are tools to optimize them as well, but they can be a little bit harder to optimize than a JPEG. There's tons of libraries out there for modifying straight images, but it's important to take a look at your process for generating SVGs as well. For example, one that I've been seeing a lot with clients recently is Figma. Figma, tons of clients are using Figma. It's a great tool. It can export SVGs pretty easily, but it also tends to have a ton of wrapper markup that just isn't necessary. So for example, I have a client that recently gave me a logo that they exported directly from Figma, and it was 22 KB, which again isn't huge, but I asked them to take a look at it, and they brought it into Illustrator and exported it in. It looks exactly the same. It's vector, so you can still blow it up as much as you need to, and it was 12K. So they saved almost 50%. And again, 10K by itself isn't a lot, but when you add it up over several SVGs, it's quite a bit, and it's their logo, so it loads on every single page.
Yeah, the worst example of that I've seen was actually a site that a colleague had just launched. And so I went in to sort of poke around and have a look. And I realized that one of the social icons that they had at the bottom of the page was an Instagram logo that when they had exported it, instead of using like a CSS gradient, it had actually rasterized that gradient. And so the actual SVG image was over 2 megabytes. And then once I went in and converted that to a CSS gradient, it was like 17K. So it was like a huge savings with almost no effort. But as you say, you definitely want to keep some visibility.
That was something that I've seen quite a bit with Figma too, is that because SVG is an element, it's a HTML element, and you can embed many things in it. And I see, again, with Figma quite a lot, somebody exports something, you accidentally select the wrong frame, and all of a sudden you're including a PNG in there. And when it wants a PNG and an SVG, it just base64 encodes it, and it's just this enormous export. So you do also want to check your SVGs, make sure you're not including extra frames, including extra markup or metadata that you don't need, and that you're optimizing that as well. But like I said, it's a little bit harder to optimize. There are sites you can upload them to, and I'd say those work probably 70% of the time. About 30% of the time, it just breaks the SVG. So you do need to be careful. But yeah, keep an eye on your SVGs as well, because you can sometimes optimize those too.
So maybe on that note, we should have a quick discussion about some of the tools that are available for checking how the images are loading on your website. So we already mentioned Google Lighthouse as a very easy way for anyone using Chrome. They can just open that up in basically a new browser window and run those tests. I also like to use the Google PageSpeed Insights, just because you're actually getting Google's perspective as it analyzes that web page on its infrastructure. So it's really like from an SEO standpoint, closer to the source of truth. But for specifically image optimization, probably the one that I like best is webpagetest.org. I think it's also getting funding from Google, but another great tool in terms of really being able to show you that full waterfall of the page and how it loads, and can be a nice, visual way to sort of call out wherever you've got images that are either taking a long time to load or also, just size-wise, well beyond what they should be.
Yeah, it's definitely. It's also, I also want to call out that it's something that you need to monitor regularly. It's not something like you just set it up once you launch, or sometimes even before you launch. Like during launch, something will happen. We just had a client site launch, and a day after launch, we looked at it, and one of the images on the site was suddenly 2.5 megabytes for some reason, because we had missed an image style for something. Well, it wasn't a Drupal project; it was a non-Drupal project, but the equivalent of the image style for that particular case. So it's definitely something that you want to monitor as well, and make sure that some of these assets aren't getting past you and that they're accounted for.
That actually raises a question for me. Is there a module that does that sort of monitoring? Like, can it look at, the rendered output or the image sizes on your front end and put a status message into the status report of like, hey, there are 25 ridiculously large images in your site. You might want to look at them. Here's the path to them. And if there isn't, Martin, in your copious amounts of free time, joking, of course, could you maybe work on that?
It's a great question. I have not heard of anything that does that. Obviously, Lighthouse being something that's scriptable, theoretically, you could build that into like a CI/CD pipeline where it could, take the scores before and after a set of changes, and then if there's some, drop in the Lighthouse score, then it could reject the commit, as an example, right? So there's those kinds of things. I know with like a site improve, there are some things around sort of, image quality and things that it'll check. I think the last time I asked about it, there wasn't anything that would specifically check if things were too high resolution, which is kind of like from a performance standpoint, something that I would really care about. There is also something, it's a browser extension called Browser Calories that you can use. Basically, when you go to a site, you click this little piece in your toolbar, this extension, and it almost opens up like the nutrition label on a box of cereal, basically showing your, how much of the page weight is for images, for JavaScript, CSS, and the actual HTML. And then it can compare those either to sort of web standard values, or you can even sort of customize those if, as part of your website planning, you've been doing things like a performance budget. You plug those values in, and page by page, it'll tell you how you're scoring against your performance budget.
It's funny. The more and more I'm thinking of this, like the more I can see a use case for like a module to help with this. And like those tools are great. And the CI/CD piece, like I think that's an awesome idea. But like I'm envisioning like what Nick was saying, right? Like, hey, content editors are adding images, adding content all the time, right? It would almost be like maybe part of the media usage module could be part of like, hey, this image is used. It's also like super big and goofy. Like maybe you want to take a look at this. But we don't have to problem solve that right here, right now. It was just a question and an idea.
I mean, to me, I would envision that being almost more like the editorially tool. Have you used that for accessibility?
Yeah.
Where it's like, as soon as you save something, it'll give you sort of a visual indication of like, hey, there's some issues here. Maybe you want to investigate. It'd be cool if it could do that from a performance standpoint as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Interesting. So
I thought Martin.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I thought Martin was just like kind of talking when he said that it looks like a nutrition facts label. It literally looks like a nutrition facts label, like this on the side of a box of cereal. This is neat.
It's funny because I could see your face in the video like light up when he said it. You're like, what? I must try this right now.
I did. I went to go look at it immediately.
Very cool. So throughout the show, we've mentioned a couple of various modules that are helpful for this process in Drupal. Can we get a compiled list of things that are helpful if you're looking to optimize a site, or you're building a new site and you want to know what's out there moving forward? What are the kinds of things that you should look into?
So I would say definitely start with some of the capabilities that are available directly within Drupal core. So we've talked about image styles and responsive images. Those are definitely, I think, going to be crucial. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually, now that you mentioned responsive images again in Drupal core, it's probably worth talking a little bit about that, like what's different there. Because Drupal has had image styles forever, right? Like, hey, if I need a thumbnail here on the teaser view, but on the actual page, I need it to be much bigger. Those are different displays. You're using a different image style. That's kind of that's pretty deep into the Drupal DNA. People know how that's used. The responsive images, though, is a module that I don't think it's enabled by default in the standard profile. So some people might not even seen it or know what it is. So it's probably worth mentioning briefly what that is. What that does is it gives you the ability to use multiple image styles for a single display and instance. So for example, like I said, you might have an image that's a hero on the main detail page of a particular product. Previously, you had to do a lot of work to make it so that you would have different image sizes depending on breakpoints. With responsive images, you can say, hey, for this particular instance on desktop, use image style 1. On mobile, use image style 2. So Drupal is still using its image styles preset, but it's automatically outputting a picture element with multiple source sets for you so that browsers are loading just the image that's available. So it basically takes the functionality that we already had with image styles and different displays and moves it to a single display and has it trigger on, well, I mean, it's media queries, so you can have it trigger on most anything that you want, but most people use different breakpoints.
Yeah, it's incredibly powerful, and it's awesome that with Drupal we really get that capability out of the box. As you say, it's something that could probably be better understood. I believe there is a module called it's like easy responsive images, something like that is meant to provide a set of presets so that out of the box you can potentially start using it. I would say probably someone wanting to to get better acquainted with those could use that module to sort of get acquainted with those. But I would say once you get your head around it, it's actually not, I think, a crazy amount of work to sort of set up specific for your own site. So I would say it's worth investing the time to really understand how that works.
So those are the two core modules that are the most helpful. I think it's responsive images, image styles, and I think if you're using responsive images, you have to use the breakpoints module as well. What's out there in Contrib?
So as we already mentioned, within core, there's that ability to do the lazy loading by default in recent versions. But if you're using an older version of core, or if you want to be able to do things like lazy load, let's say video players, which can be beneficial from a performance standpoint, you can use, Blazy module, or there's other Contrib modules as well that sort of can help with that lazy loading aspect. For image cropping, I would say use the crop API module, and then you want to either use the focal point or image widget crop. So it's sort of two different approaches to giving your content creators editorial control in terms of how those images will be cropped to different image styles.
I think focal point is one that I've used quite a bit, and just to describe what that does a little bit more, right? So like when you're resizing an image, you can, scale and crop the image, but scaling and cropping is sometimes not as smart as one would like it to be. And like, if you have an image of people, for example, happy family, scale and crop could lop dad off the right side of that image, where you're oh, now it's not, and now it's half a family or a quarter of a family, whatever. Focal point is one of those great modules that allows you to actually select the important part of that image and preserves it in the crop. So it makes it a little bit smarter. The image widget crop, I don't know if that does the same sort of thing, but focal point's one that I typically the design team really appreciates on any given project, because they're like, well, we need to make sure that this is preserved in this image.
Yeah. So the big difference between the two is focal point allows you to say this is the most important part of it, and as long as you have an image style that's using the focal point, it will make sure that that piece is centered in whatever crop you're doing. Image widget crop, which has been a long time since I used it, gives you a box of all the different image styles that are being created, and you can literally select by hovering over the image where they are. It's been so long since I've used it. Does it work with multiple image styles? Can you choose all of them now? Because I remember at one point there's a limitation.
Right. So if I recall correctly, and has already been described, I've definitely used focal point more often, but I have seen the image widget crop with multiple image styles, and it basically gives the user sort of a modal where they can, for each of those image styles, specifically designate what area they want cropped. So I feel like for image editors or sort of content creators that are very, very specific and want to be able to crop in very deliberate ways, that can be a good solution. Yeah. But I would say more generally, probably focal point is a pretty good solution.
I do want to call out one tip for listeners, though, by the way. So I think both of these modules, focal point at least, the way that you set it up is you have to change the form widget to use focal point, and then that gives users the ability to select the focal point when they're uploading the image. If you're using media library is one of the only things in core that uses a separate display, form display. So if you're trying to enable focal point for a media library image, you need to make sure you're looking at the media library form display for the field that you're working on. Otherwise, you won't see the focal point widget and you won't be able to select it. There's one other caveat with media, in that you can't edit the focal point of an existing media entity from whatever entity is using it. So for example, if you have a blog and you upload a media image, you can select the focal point at the time of uploading. But then if you edit that blog page after, you cannot edit the focal point there. You have to find the media entity itself and edit it to edit the focal point, which then of course will update that focal point for every single instance of that media entity.
Basically going back to the root asset, not to the reference of that asset.
Yeah, which is frustrating, but I think that's why the entity usage module, I think gets most of its use from things like this, because that makes it easy to find the media entity. But yeah, just keep that in mind if you're trying to implement focal point and you're using media library. You have to update the media library form display, or you won't find it, and you have to edit the root entity where the image is actually uploaded if you want to change that. Okay, what else we got? We got a long list of modules here.
Absolutely. So we already talked about the Webp module, and as well as there being a couple of sort of alternates there, especially if you want to use AVIF or similar. So modules that supports kind of those different raster formats that we talked about. Svg Image Field is, full disclosure, one that I maintain. So for working with SVG images, that's the one that I would personally recommend. And then the image optimize API is really the way to build those pipelines where you can add steps for, optimizing the images. You can do things like, force JPEGs to be progressive. So lots of different capabilities there in terms of really getting the most out of the performance for your images.
SVG Image Field is one of those ones that I feel definitely belongs in core at some point. Like it's the one that I always forget. Like I think I have it on every single project, and I always forget. And I go to upload an SVG and go, wait, oh yeah, I need a module for that.
Yeah, although I feel like it could also be a case where, because I feel like the SVG space is kind of still evolving quite quickly.
Yeah, maybe
it can probably evolve, on its own a little more quickly, being outside of core in the contrib space. So
that might make sense. I mean, it's super stable, so maybe it makes sense to stay in contrib too. Right. Not everything has to be in core.
So the last part of this question is actually kind of around compression utilities, not so much Drupal modules, although I think ImageMagick does have a corresponding Drupal module. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering, Martin, what do you prefer between like the standard Drupal GD library and something like ImageMagick? Are there, is there a reason why you might choose one over the other, or something that one does that really makes it more useful?
So what I've heard is that ImageMagick is really best practice just because it doesn't run as a PHP process. So the work of working with, say, those big images, converting them between formats and potentially scaling them is something that doesn't take memory away from other sort of PHP processes that might be running. So from that standpoint, I've heard people say that ImageMagick is a better way to go if you have that available.
It also has a better logo. It's a little wizard.
It's also a little bit more customizable, I think, at the server level than maybe the GD library. Is that accurate?
I would say if you have control over, exactly what's installed on the server, it's probably going to be easier to tweak that than sort of like recompiling your PHP to use different GD extensions and so on.
Got it. That makes sense.
Okay.
All right. Well, this has been a very comprehensive look at optimizing images, and even I learned something. Actually, more than one something, quite a few somethings. Martin, before we let you go, I'm wondering, is there anything else that we should share with our listeners? Anything that we might have forgotten?
So I think when we mentioned the browser calories extension, we touched a little bit on the idea of performance budget, but I would say for a lot of teams when they're planning their website, that's definitely something to really think about and potentially include as sort of part of your key metrics.
And I'm sure you're of the school of like, you should be doing performance testing all throughout your project instead of like saving it for the end.
Well, and to the point of what was said earlier, like not stopping the visibility on that when the site launches, right? It should be something that has ongoing visibility, just like accessibility, a variety of other concerns that, you don't stop caring about that stuff as soon as the site launches.
It's funny. Everybody's using content management systems now. And it's like one of those things that back in the day, you'd post a website and you'd be like, it's done. It's great. It's beautiful. But now, like, your content's always changing. You always have to be testing. You always have to be keeping an eye on things, because at any given moment, it could go awry.
Well, and John, it sounds like you're going to build that cool Drupal module that gives us the image performance visibility, right?
I can guarantee you that would be a module that would not work very well or work to the intended outcome.
Be a good learning experience.
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking for this module to launch sometime in the next 10 years, yeah, it could be a good learning experience.
I mean, Drupal's been around for 22 years, so I think 10 years from now is okay.
2032.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you, Martin, for joining us again to share your knowledge and talking about image styles. It's one of those things, like, these are the types of things that always inspire me to be more careful and try to see how much smaller you can make a site, because there's always changing technologies here, and sometimes it's a little hard to keep on top of it. So hopefully this will help inspire people to look into some of these modules too, and we can make the web a little bit smaller. It also really brings me back. I mean, this type of show really brings me back to the episode that we talked about the environmental impact that your website has, and having a larger site means that older phones take longer to download it, and people need to have the phones on longer, which also means that their phone will last less long. So this also helps. This also helps the environment.
I think there's another show in this. The show title could potentially be "How Your Crappy Image Optimization is Killing the Environment."
It's killing the earth. Yeah.
Yeah. Huh. All right. We'll put that on the list.
And on that happy note,
do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, Chad's Book Corner, and much, much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choose Become a Patron. Well, Martin, thank you for joining us again. If our listeners had more questions about image optimization or the plethora of modules that you maintain, how could they get in touch with you?
So on Drupal.org, Drupal Slack, or various social platforms, I can be reached as Manclue.
Aaron, thank you for joining us for your first guest host slot in the show. If our listeners want to get in touch with you, what would be the best way?
Yes, on Drupal.org, I am 9lives Black Cat. And on Twitter, I am at TaronG, TeaRyneg.
And John, who are you?
I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi, as well as Drupal.org. And you can find out about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And listeners can get in touch with me at Nixvan, NICXVAN, pretty much everywhere.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Have a good one, everyone.
See you guys next week.